A crowd gathered by sunset. People from the neighborhood who'd heard rumors, whispering and pointing at the half-and-half cabin now resembling something out of a cartoon. I gave no interviews, but I could see cell phones recording. Brad, now boxed into a half-home with no access to plumbing or the only functioning bathroom, stood inside the doorway looking lost. He tried yelling something about calling the police. I just waved at him and said, "Please do. I'd love to show them the paperwork." Karen retreated for now, clearly regrouping. But I knew she wouldn't let this go quietly. This was more than property to her. It was image control pride. She wasn't used to losing, and certainly not publicly. But what she hadn't figured out yet was that the more noise she made, the more eyes turned toward the truth, and the truth was not on her side. I ended the day by installing a sign on my side of the fence, right where the property line began. It read, "Private property, verified and protected. Trespassers will be publicly embarrassed." It wasn't a legal notice. It was a message. One Karen wouldn't miss. That night, as I sat under the stars, I remembered my dad's words when I told him I hated dealing with bullies. He said, "Don't fight bullies with fists. Fight them with paperwork, patience, and precision. Make them step into their own trap." I smiled and looked at the half-cabin, glowing awkwardly with light only on one side. One trap down. A few more to go. The next morning began with a phone call from Alan, the land use attorney. He'd filed the cease and desist and had already received a response, one that surprised both of us. Instead of refuting the facts or offering compromise, the HOA, through Karen, had submitted a claim to the county arguing that the property had been erroneously excluded from HOA oversight due to clerical oversight. Their angle now was that the historical paperwork was flawed and that my property should have been considered within the HOA bounds since the beginning. It was a desperate move, a gamble relying on technical confusion. Alan calmly told me it wouldn't stick, but he warned me that Karen was trying to delay things, likely to exhaust me and force me to drop it. What she didn't know was that I had patience to spare, and the longer she played her game, the more rope she gave me to pull taut. After the call, I drove straight to the county records office again. This time, I wasn't just looking for boundary maps, I was looking for something deeper. Historical documents, the original subdivision filings, and anything with my father's name on it. The archivist on duty was an older gentleman named Ralph, who remembered my dad. When I explained the situation, his eyebrows lifted. "Oh, you mean the easement case? I think your dad won that back in the 70s. Hang on." He disappeared into the back room and returned with a cracked leather binder that smelled like dust and forgotten argument. Inside was the golden ticket, a signed agreement between my father and the county, predating the HOA entirely, which declared a permanent residential easement on the property with explicit protection from future zoning overlays. I asked Ralph if I could get a certified copy. He gave me 5. For free. Back home, I scanned each page and sent it to Alan, who called 5 minutes later laughing. "You're holding a legal nuke. This document voids any claim the HOA makes, retroactively and going forward. This is bigger than we thought. It's not just exclusion, it's exemption with teeth." I asked what I should do next. He said, "Hold off on legal action for now. Let's see how far they'll go. And keep building that fence. It's the most polite form of war I've ever seen." By the afternoon, I was back on the property with the fencing crew, who had become oddly invested in the whole saga. One of them, a guy named Marcus, brought me a sandwich and said, "You know, we've done some weird jobs, but I think this is the first time I've ever built a fence through someone's kitchen island." I smiled and told him it was probably the first time anyone had. We finished the interior divide and began sealing off the exterior with gate. Brad, stuck on his half with no utilities and a bedroom that now opened to a wall, spent most of the day pacing and calling his mom. He looked completely overwhelmed. I almost felt bad for him, but then I remembered how casually he'd flipped through my dad's photo albums like they were trash. Karen returned around sunset, wearing a wide-brimmed hat and carrying a clipboard. She marched up to the crew and demanded to see permit. I handed her a full folder. County approval, contractor licenses, boundary survey, the works. She scanned them like she might find a typo that could cancel the entire project. When she found nothing, she muttered that she'd be elevating this to the HOA legal committee. I reminded her that the committee had already lost 2 members since she started this nonsense. She ignored me and stormed back to her golf cart, but not before yelling to Brad, "Don't move! We're fighting this!" He looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. The next day, something unexpected happened. A small group of HOA members knocked on my truck window while I was reviewing blueprints. One of them, a woman named Joyce, was on the board. She apologized for the entire ordeal and admitted that most of them had no idea Karen had moved her son into my cabin. According to her, Karen had filed everything quietly, presenting it as an emergency caretaker arrangement with full board support, only she never asked the board. She just told them after the fact, assuming they'd go along with it. But now that the paperwork had surfaced, and especially the easement agreement, people were jumping ship. Joyce whispered that there would be a board vote soon and that Karen's removal was all but certain. I didn't celebrate. Not yet. I had learned to be cautious. But I did feel the tide turning. And I decided it was time to escalate on my end too. That evening, I emailed the local paper. Nothing sensational, just a polite tip about a legal boundary dispute involving HOA overreach, an inherited cabin, and a homeowner who built a literal fence down the middle of his property. The editor replied within an hour. They were sending a reporter and photographer the next morning. I didn't tell anyone. I wanted it to be a surprise. The reporter, a woman named Elise, arrived with a camera guy in tow. She was young, sharp, and clearly used to small-town dramas. When she saw the cabin, with its perfect wooden divide running from front porch to lake deck, she whistled low. "This is better than I expected," she said. I gave her the whole story, calmly, factually, with documents in hand. I showed her the footage from the wildlife camera that captured Brad changing the lock. I even played her the voicemail Karen left me a few weeks ago saying, "It's not about ownership. It's about what's best for the community." She didn't realize it was legally useful, but it was. Elise promised a fair article, and judging by her questions, I had a feeling Karen wasn't going to like it. Sure enough, the story hit the paper the next day. The headline read, "HOA overreach sparks cabin war, local man builds fence through living room." It included photos, quotes from me and from Ralph at the county office, and even a shot of Karen trying to block the surveyor with her sun hat shading half her face like a movie villain. The comments section exploded. Locals, nearby townsfolk, even people from other states weighed in. Most sided with me, some mocked the absurdity, and a few shared their own horror stories about HOAs behaving like mini-dictatorship. The article made it onto regional social media pages and started spreading. Karen's little power play had gone national. I watched from the porch as Karen drove by in her golf cart that afternoon, her face stiff and unreadable. She didn't stop. Brad, meanwhile, had moved his cot to the other side of the cabin, clearly trying to stay out of view. I heard him on a phone call that evening, begging someone to let him crash on their couch for a few nights. It was working. The pressure, the attention, the exposure, it was unraveling everything Karen had built. But I wasn't finished. The fence was a statement. The documents were armor. The story was leverage. But now, with the historical easement in hand and half the board turning against her, I had the opportunity to do something Karen would never see coming. I called Alan again that night and asked if we could begin the process of landmark registration for the cabin. He paused, then laughed softly. "You're going for the kill shot," he said. I replied, "No. I'm just making sure this never happens again." He told me he'd start the paperwork the next morning. The cabin my dad built wasn't just a home. It was a piece of history. And now I was going to make sure no HOA president, no petty tyrant, and no entitled son would ever lay claim to it again. Not with their fake letters, their clipboards, or their made-up clauses. Karen had tried to play queen, but she forgot that kings build castles, and I was about to fortify mine for good. The morning the landmark application was submitted, the air around the cabin felt different, like the whole property knew a final move had been made. The fence stood tall and stubborn, a perfect divider slicing through the center of the cabin like a judge's gavel. Brad's side looked increasingly abandoned, fewer lights on, garbage piling up near the front door, and the TV, which once blared all hours of the day, now silent. Karen hadn't been seen since the article hit the papers. Her golf cart sat unused in her driveway, which felt almost unnatural considering she usually rode it like a chariot from house to house. But I knew silence from her wasn't surrender, it was strategy. She was planning something, and I was ready. Around mid-morning, I received a visit from Joyce and 2 other board members, Tom and Linda. They weren't smiling, but they weren't hostile either. Joyce got right to the point. We're calling a vote this week. Karen's conduct, the false filing, the misuse of emergency authority. It's too much. And with the article out, half the neighborhood is furious. Tom added, some of us didn't even know your property wasn't within the HOA border. She lied. She just assumed you'd fold like the others. I nodded, appreciating their honesty. They handed me a copy of the formal agenda for the emergency board meeting scheduled for Friday night. Karen's name was at the top, listed under Presidential Conduct Review. I thanked them and told them I hoped the vote went the way it needed to. Linda gave me a quiet smile and said, win or lose, you embarrassed the hell out of her. For a lot of people, that's already enough. Later that day, as if on cue, the local fire inspector arrived. He wore a crisp uniform and carried a clipboard, claiming he was there to investigate a community concern about unsafe modifications to a residential structure. I didn't have to ask who filed the complaint. I greeted him politely and invited him in. He stepped inside, examined the fence, walked around the split kitchen, and took some pictures. After a thorough walkthrough, he chuckled and said, this is probably the cleanest structure I've seen all week. Who built this fence? I told him I had it professionally installed with county approval. He nodded and said, well, whoever reported you didn't do their homework. You're fully compliant. There's nothing dangerous about this. It's hilarious, but not dangerous. He left a report stating there were no violations. I watched him leave, then waited. Sure enough, within the hour, Karen pulled up in her golf cart, her mouth already twisted with false concern. She didn't even try to greet me. You bribed him, didn't you? She snapped. There's no way that structure is safe. You're housing someone in a divided building. That's a liability. I stood quietly on my side of the porch, arms folded. You're welcome to contact the county yourself. Just be prepared for them to show you the same documents you've been ignoring for weeks. Her face turned red. She wasn't used to losing. She certainly wasn't used to being on the receiving end of a bureaucracy she once weaponized. This isn't over, she hissed. You're making a mockery of this entire neighborhood. I gave her a calm, measured smile. I'm just enforcing the boundary lines your HOA failed to acknowledge. If that's a mockery, then the problem started long before I picked up a hammer. That night, I lit a small fire in the backyard pit on my side of the fence and grilled dinner while listening to the cricket. A couple neighbors stopped by, bringing folding chairs and paper plates. We shared food, stories, and laughter. One of them, an older man named Ernie, told me he'd lived in the neighborhood since before the HOA existed and that my dad once helped him fix a flooded crawl space during a storm. Your old man was stubborn but fair, Ernie said. He wouldn't have put up with this either. You're doing him proud. It wasn't just a nice sentiment. It gave me fuel. Because this fight wasn't about principle anymore. It was about legacy. 2 days before the board meeting, Karen made her next move. I woke to find another notice posted on my truck windshield. This one from an alleged neighborhood zoning safety committee, demanding I cease construction and remove the fence or face further penalties.